Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you see, today's topic is part B of our lecture on the Islamic world. Now, as always, before we begin, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to the right, and pay particular attention to those keywords at your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off talking about, basically the background to this lecture, which is Muhammad's rise, what he saw as the problems in the Arabian region. And then finally, as he's approaching his death, it is really beginning to spread through the Arabian Peninsula. Right there. Now, what happens, however, is that by the time of his death in 632, most of Arabia was now under Islamic control. And this was done, and this is the reason for this, is that by this point, the edges, the periphery, the frontiers of both the Byzantine and the Sassanid empires were very weak. And Islam will begin to just spread and expand in this region. But there is going to become kind of a turning point here where things could have really went awry. And in some ways they did, but Islam is going to continue to spread anyway. And it begins over the issue of when Muhammad dies. Because there's question over who should succeed him as the leader of the Islamic community, but also military and political leader. And what it does is it causes a schism or a split within the Muslim community. There were the Shiites, who believe that the next leader, should be selected according to hereditary lines. In other words, you should pick someone who's related to Muhammad. And he's had that same bloodline. And then there was the Sunnis, who were very pious Muslims, who believed that you need to choose the best person. And so, upon Muhammad's death, there became this chaos and fraction between various camps of the Islamic community. The Shiites believe that it should be hereditary leadership, and therefore they favored Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali. However, the Sunnis believe that the best choice was a close companion of Muhammad, though not related by blood, known as Abu Bakr. And what this is going to lead to is a kind of break within the community of believers. Ali was passed over in favor of Abu Bakr to be the caliph, which greatly upset those Shiites who believed that this was almost defamation, that it was just a very serious blunder to their faith. But this election is going to lead to a split between the Sunni and Shiite sects. The Sunnis take over. They're the ones in power now because they're the ones who favored Abu Bakr. And they will have their capital at Damascus. The caliph will be powerful and form an imperial empire. And they will continue to expand under this Umayyad dynasty from Afghanistan all the way to Spain. And that shocks some students who may not know their history very well, but yes, this empire will spread into the mainland peninsula of Spain until the 11th century CE. So you're talking 400 plus years it's going to remain in Spain. And it will continue being important in Spain until the Age of Exploration in the late 1400s, early 1500s. And it will thrive while the rest of Western Europe is floundering in the Dark Ages, in the collapse of Rome. And it thrives in large part thanks to trade and technology from the Arab trading partners. The government was a highly organized bureaucracy. Muslims taxed for charity purposes, and non-Muslims paid taxes to support the government. There was some intermarrying, there was definitely conversion, though there was very few financial benefits to convert at the time. And converts were not considered part of the Ummah, but rather Mawali. There was slavery. However, only non-Muslims could be enslaved. And slaves were able to purchase their freedom. Note, this is not the idea of chattel slavery that we will have in the United States. This is rather more of you fall into either you're taken captive or you fall into debt, but you can purchase your freedom. And children of slaves who converted would be free. Merchants were highly honored within the Islamic world, in large part because trade made a lot of money, but also because Muhammad himself was a trader. Now, in 750, there would be a rebellion by the Malawi. And remember, the Malawi are not part of the Ummah. They're not part of the community of believers. They feel they're being left out, despite the fact they are converting to Islam. And there will be a rebellion in 750 CE, and we will create a whole new dynasty. When the Mawali rebel, they will form a new dynasty, the Abbasid, and they will have their center on Baghdad, modern day Iraq. They will control territory from Turkey into Central Asia and across North Africa, though the Umayyads will continue staying in Spain. They will claim direct bloodline descent from Muhammad's uncle, which was far more acceptable to the Shiite faction of Islam. And they will change their policy to open religions to all on an equal basis. In other words, they practice religious toleration. And doing this really helped set and establish Islam as a universalizing religion. In other words, it was easy to accept or coexist with Islam throughout the world, throughout the trading world. It created a very cosmopolitan mix of cultures that included Arabs, Persians, Turks, Ethiopians, Europeans, Christians, Indians, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims. And within this empire, Sharia law took shape. The military command had power. As the army grew, it grew difficult for the caliph to control the commanders. In other words, there began to be this split within the government, as the caliphs the religious political leaders were having to vie for power against the religious leaders. But that aside, this era ushers in a golden age of Islam, because there were many advances in this time linked specifically to what was created, which was essentially Dar al-Islam, a golden age of Islam, but also peace in the trading region that was controlled by the Islamic Empire. Arabic as a language became a unifying force. And again, this was also partly so you could read the Quran, but it became the general trading language. Paper from China encouraged the production of books and poetry. Universities and madrasas preserved writings of ancient Greeks and Italian, or they preserved the history. Muslim art, however, would forbid lifelike representations of human figures, including that of Muhammad. In fact, you'll see most Islamic art will have no face for Muhammad or will have him shadowed. We will also see within Persian art, Muhammad, rather than being shadowed, no face, will actually have a veil on his face to cover his face because it's too holy to depict. You will also see heavy use of mathematical calculations, geometrical figures. The mosque will be very ornately designed. Arabic numerals from India will be imported. So what stops it? Well, ultimately, the causes of fall would be social stratification. Arabs were playing an increasingly smaller role in society as Turks and non-Arabs merged in. Notice that's what happened before when the Malawi were separated. Well, when the ruling elites did not incorporate new peoples who felt they deserved their own say in government, it begins to cause internal pressures, internal strife. Likewise, there's the ongoing hostility between the Shiites and the Sunnis. And then also you have peasant uprising and slave revolts over those who are just poor and don't feel they're being treated properly. All these internal social stratification issues. Additionally, different Islamic groups were vying for power. The Abbasids were hiring Turks as soldiers, and these Turks began to gain a lot of power because the military commanded a lot of respect, a lot of authority, and had a lot of, resources. And ultimately, the Turk leader took over Baghdad, and the caliph became simply a figurehead. And then ultimately, it just became too large to administrate. It was too difficult to hold together this very diverse empire from a central location. And, of course, the always incompetent rulers, or in this case, the caliphs. In the end, by 1258, the Mongols will seize the throne and will create a whole new empire in the region. But what we do see is that even with the fall of the Abbasid Empire, Islam will continue to flourish. At times quietly, at times violently, it will begin to spread. In tropical areas, peoples were linked by this common religion and also had increasingly complex trade networks. Now, and you can see all these places on the screen now. And again, take a quick picture or hit pause on the video, write it all down. But even after the fall of the Abbasid Empire, the ideas of the Muslim world or the Islamic world is going to continue all throughout the region. And you see all the places that it still existed in where it was not put down. And Islam itself became the unifying force. Now, within these regions, however, there would be some very distinct gender roles. Men made all the major decision. Men could have up to 4 wives. And this was in part due to practicality. I'm going to say practicality. Because, well, men traveled quite often along vast areas for trading purposes as a merchant. And they wanted basically a wife in each of the major areas they lived in. And ultimately, divorce was pretty easy. Women would lose rights as Islam spread east. And this is often in part because it came in contact with other religions and belief systems and began to adopt. Remember, originally Muhammad believed more equality. And women had more rights. You could abuse women, etc. And divorce was granted. But as Islam moved east, it began to meld with other religions and cultures and ideas. And as it did, women would lose all rights. They were often secluded in their homes. They had fewer educational opportunities. They had a more restrictive dress code. Divorce became nearly impossible. And they were just not secularly equal. While they might share some equality in the spiritual realm in terms of their relationship to Allah, in practical everyday terms, in the secular world, they were, well, beneath. So why does it spread? Well, despite the decline of the dynasty caliphates we talked about, Islam would continue to spread its influence, reinforcing again that religion was the unifying force of this era, rather than empire or nationhood. Likewise, the trade networks were extremely important because they are going to link the lands of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Merchants traveled the Silk Road and Indian Ocean routes. The cultural centers of Cairo, Mecca, Alexandria, Baghdad, these were trading centers in addition to capitals. And thousands upon thousands of people would travel there each year. And when they came in to these areas, merchants came in, they would hear about these new religious ideas or new ideas going on, culturally and religiously. They would take those back with them. Likewise, Sufis were missionaries. They were merchant missionaries. In other words, these were Muslims who would spread Islam peacefully and who they would go into these other regions as merchants and traders, and they would take their faith with them and act as missionaries. In addition, Muslims were very tolerant of conquered peoples, which often left to acceptance in the future. In fact, conquered Jews and Christians would often convert to Islam because of the similarities, especially in their backgrounds. And it began to spread, and Islam began to take hold in these new regions, including, as you see on the screen, India. See, India, as we talked about previously, had often been fragmented into regional kingdoms. And rather than have a government become the unifying, or an empire become the unifying force, it was belief system. became social and cultural conditions that became the glue that held India together, much like the Holy Roman Church did in Europe. The caste system in Hindu religion gave the region, its own identity. The arrival of Islam would come in, and while it never becomes a dominant faith in the region like it does in the Middle East or North Africa or even Persia, it does make some inroads into India. And part of the reason for this was that, unlike its relationship with, say, Christianity or Judaism, where they had similar backgrounds, there was a very sharp cultural divide between Islam and Hinduism, which is what prevents mass conversion to the religion. Because, remember, Islam rejects the caste system. It rejects the idea of inequality and also reincarnation. And these were through some very steep divides that were hard to get through. But nonetheless, there would develop a small pocket regions within India of Islam. You see on the screen, we call it the Delhi Sultanate. So in the 11th century, Afghan warlords would invade northern India. And they would loot the Hindu and Buddhist temples and establish mosques or Islamic shrines. The successors of this invasion would be established the Delhi Sultanate, the first Muslim empire on the Indian subcontinent. Now, please note, this is not an extension of the Middle Eastern or Persian Empire. This is a separate autonomous empire. The sultans would fight Hindu princes for control, and they would have large armies and extravagant courts. They will fight to keep out invaders, including the Mongols that we'll talk about later. And they will blend Islam with some of the Hindu culture, create a brand new division known as Sikhism. This is the blending of both Islam and Hinduism. Devotion to one god, so it is monotheistic, but does embrace the Hindu concepts of karma and rebirth. And you see the founder of it on the screen is Guru Nanak. Now, while this is a brand new sect of Islam, it was not as successful at wholesale conversion as the Arabs were. Only about 25% of Indians would convert. And Indians were often allowed to keep their own native religions. But what we do see as Sikhism grew, Buddhism itself dwindled. Though the dominant one was still Hinduism. Merchants were still the primary carriers of the faith, especially the Sufis, who were those missionaries. And they would welcome Indians in lower caste, and conversion would allow some alleviation of tax and allow intermarriage to take place. And you can see, unlike other religions compared to Islam, Hinduism and Islam were very different types of religion, which was why it made it very difficult to spread in this region. But to the northwest, we get to modern-day Turkey. This was at the time governed by the Byzantine Empire. It was filled with It was filled with Christians and Greek-speaking people, and had been invaded by the Turks. The result was a huge cultural transformation. By 1500, on the age of exploration, 90% of the population was Muslim and Turkish-speaking. Notice that. This was part of the old Byzantine Empire. 80+% of the people were Christian and spoke Greek. Within just a couple hundred years, 90% was now Muslim and Turkish-speaking. Now, one of the reasons it was easy to convert was there are only about 8 million people living there, which is a fairly small population. There had been extensive disruption to Anatolian society when the Byzantine Empire had weakened. There was enslavement, famine, massacre, church property had been destroyed, lots of discrimination, and many Christians came to believe that these disasters were proof that Islam was the true religion. And Unlike India, the cultural barriers were much less severe because most people in Anatolia were already monotheistic, they were Christian, and Muslim had respect for Jesus and other Christian scriptures, especially the Old Testament. Remember, under Islam, Jesus was a holy prophet, just not the last prophet. Whereas Christians would believe, he's the final. Muslims believe there was more. But so the area had been destroyed as the Byzantine Empire had been weakened, and the Muslims come in and they begin to rebuild schools, mills, orchards, hospices, and create rest places for travelers. Remember, this is a region you see on the map there. This is bridging the Middle East into Europe. Again, a very important trade area. Next, West Africa. And again, this is being spread, or Islam's being spread here by these traders across the Saharan desert, especially the trans-Saharan trade. And in many areas here, like we saw in Anatolia, that this was a very peaceful and voluntary acceptance of Islam, especially in these urban centers of West African empires, including Ghana, Songhai, Mali. Many West African cities became these major centers of Islamic religious and intellectual life, especially places like Timbuktu, which established more than 150 Quranic schools, established several major centers of higher education. They housed libraries of more than thousands upon thousands of texts. The construction of huge mosques, and you see the bottom right there. And they will adopt Arabic as the language of religion, education, administration, and trade. And then finally, also in Spain. The Umayyad dynasty had conquered into the southern region of Spain on mainland Europe. They created a peaceful, vibrant civilization where medicine, the arts, architecture, literature, and astronomy flourished. There was harmony, intolerance between Muslim rulers and Christian and Jewish subjects. And there was freedom of religion. And so from about 650 all the way until almost the 11th century, there was this toleration and coexistence where Muslims were in control, but had great toleration of both the Christians and the Jews who lived in what is now Spain. However, by the 11th century, that age of toleration ends. There will be increasing warfare between the Christian states in northern Spain, who wanted to force out the Muslim states to the south. And they would try to push and prevent more rigid forms of Islam from coming from North Africa. In the end, by the 11th century, Muslims avoided contact with Christians. Christians' homes were actually lower class than the Muslim homes. Priests had been forbidden to carry crosses or Bibles. And by 1200, Christians began to rise up and try to push Muslims out. And finally, in 1492, just before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Christians will finally expel all Muslims from Spain. Now, what is the point of all this? Why does all this matter? Well, the reality is, as Islam spreads, it does bring a number of contributions, including the famous House of Wisdom. Founded by the Caliph al-Ma'mun, it was a research center in Baghdad. Scholars translated texts from Greek, Persian, and Indian into Arabic, performed scientific experiments. This is going to preserve some of those old texts that we now use to study history with. In addition, they invented algebra and created equations to solve for curves and lines. They will improve the Greek astrolabe to determine the position of the stars and the movement of the planets. And the astrolabe also would make navigation easier and safer on high seas. In alchemy, they will develop the idea of what's called alchemy, or attempting to turn lead into gold. Al-Raziz, you see him pictured on the top left, he will classify chemical substances as animal, mineral, or vegetable. and essentially creates a science of optics, studying light and its effects on sight. There will be tremendous advances in surgery and prescription drugs. Both the physicians Al-Raziz and Ibn Sina, top left, will accurately diagnose many diseases including hay fever, measles, smallpox, diphtheria, rabies, and diabetes. Doctors, Arab doctors, will perform hernia operations, cataract operations, and also fill teeth with gold. Now understand how important this is. This is a time in the world where most of the world is still seeing disease in religious terms. And just saying, oh, that's the work of the devil, or that's just because you're not Christian enough, or not faithful enough. And these doctors of the Islamic world are discovering modern diseases, the ideas of modern diseases, what causes them. They will also, separately from these discoveries, but in manufacturing, begin to better produce steel. In banking, they will create a banking system throughout the world, throughout the Islamic world, that will allow not just central banks, but also branch banks, and allow checks and credits and currency exchange. Because remember, trade networks are very important to the Islamic community and, of course, the Islamic world. They are the ones who are going to really help run and facilitate the Silk Road trade, the Indian Ocean trade, this Trans-Saharan trade. And they will work with local worker and craft guilds to create quality regulation and price regulation. So, how do we conclude this? Well, the Islamic civilization, the Islamic world, it's not just a network of faith, but it's a network of exchange of goods, technologies, food products, and ideas. Muslims would trade spices, carpets, glass, textiles, technologies, steel. They would trade for silk in China, rubies from India, ivory and slaves from Africa. And they would buy and sell these goods in bazaars or marketplaces. And what these became is these very cosmopolitan trading centers that will not only serve to bring cultures in contact with one another, but also help facilitate the spread of Islamic faith. Now, we're going to stop right there. We'll pick up our next lecture next time. So until then, take care, and bye-bye.